Bonjour à tous et bienvenue sur le Forum politique. Je suis Elliott, votre animateur, et je suis aujourd'hui en présence de Kathy Bunka, ex-ambassadrice du Canada en Irak et chargée d'affaires à l'ambassade canadienne en Slovaquie. L'entrevue d'aujourd'hui va se dérouler en anglais, donc pour ceux qui voudraient avoir une transcription de l'entrevue en français, on va rendre disponible des sous-titres sur la version YouTube. Kathy, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you for accepting the invitation.
I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Are you ready to start?
I'm ready.
Perfect. So to start simple, what first drew you to diplomacy? Was it a specific moment or more of a gradual calling?
Well, for me, there was a specific moment, and oddly, it happened in Tokyo. I was there on a study tour with 9 other federal parliamentary interns, part of something called the Parliamentary Internship Program. And we were learning about Japanese politics, foreign relations, and how government works. An amazing experience. Up until then, I was not aware at all that Canada even had a diplomatic service. And I knew nothing about the public service. I had never had a member of my family or friends of my family who were in the public service. I'm the daughter of a car mechanic from Sudbury, Ontario. So I was interested in international affairs, yes, but a diplomatic career path was nowhere on my radar. And as part of this study tour to Japan, we met with a diplomat at the Canadian Embassy in Tokyo, and he was confident, he was knowledgeable, he understood Japan, he spoke Japanese, he understood Canada, he understood Canadian politics, and he seemed to know how to move between those two worlds in a really intelligent way. So I registered the profession of diplomacy as one that would require judgment, good relationships, understanding another country deeply, and representing Canada well. So that meeting in Tokyo crystallized it for me.
Was there a turning point that really shaped your career?
There was. A real turning point for me was my first assignment to Canada's mission to the United Nations in New York. Until then, I think I had a somewhat idealized view of diplomacy, making international peace agreements and high-level negotiations. I understood that my job as a diplomat would involve reporting, analysis, relationship building, and representing Canada abroad, but I had not yet fully grasped how transactional it could be. I'll explain. At the UN, you see very quickly that diplomacy is often about an exchange. You give and you get. There's a great deal of vote trading, for example. Countries are making pragmatic calculations all the time. For example, if we support your candidacy for a committee or a leadership position or an advocacy initiative, what might we gain in return? That doesn't mean that our values disappear, but it does mean that the national interests are constantly in play, often in very direct ways. I also came to understand something important about domestic politics. Canada's work at the United Nations isn't only about international peace and security or these lofty principles of multilateralism. Our politicians, our Canadian politicians, well, they're also managing several domestic considerations. For example, the interests of their political party, the interests of their constituents, commercial interests, the interests of lobby groups that go in and meet with politicians every day, and local and regional pressures. So those realities, those very pragmatic realities, travel with you into the diplomatic arena. So that posting at Canada's delegation to the UN in New York, it was a turning point for me because it stripped away a certain innocence. I arrived at the UN with an idealistic view of how the system worked, and I left with a more realistic view. Not disillusioned exactly, but certainly less naive and more aware, much more aware, that diplomacy is conducted at the intersection of principle, pragmatism, and politics.
And I'm curious about how you see the role itself. Would you say that diplomacy is more about strategy or more about human connection?
I like your question. It's important. I don't think diplomacy is one or the other. I would say, though, that diplomacy is about strategic human connections. Yes, strategy matters. You need to know what your government is trying to achieve, what your country's interests are, and you need to be strategic about how to advance those interests. But you do that through people. When you're posted abroad, one of your main responsibilities is to build, maintain, and expand a network of trusted local contacts. That network is how you get things done. It's how you connect Canadian businesses to buyers. It's how you connect Canadian politicians to their political counterparts. It's how you connect Canadian officials to the experts and the decision makers in your host country. And it's also having strategic human connections. It's how you get at that insightful reporting that is so important, and you identify openings that might otherwise be missed. So from the day you arrive on a posting, from day one, you should be asking yourself, who do I need to know here? Who is actually influential? Who is trustworthy? And with whom do I need to build enough confidence that they will be frank with me when it matters? Because the point is not to collect business cards. The point is to build a network that helps Canada achieve its objectives. And that requires judgment. Some people have very senior titles and will tell you absolutely nothing. Others, well, they might be less powerful, but much more candid, smarter, more useful to you. A good diplomat has to know the difference. You have to identify the people who will actually level with you and who can work with you in a serious way. And like any other relationship, you need to invest in it before you need something. What's true in our personal life is also true in diplomacy. If you only appear when you want a favor, you've probably waited too long. And I'm going to give you a little anecdote. So I learned this lesson very clearly when I was Canada's political counselor in the Palestinian territories. We have a Canadian representative office in Ramallah in the West Bank. And when you're posted to Palestinian territory, you cover the West Bank and Gaza. So in January 2006, a designated terror group, Hamas, won the legislative elections. That was a major concern because Canada was providing substantial development assistance to the Palestinian people. And the question immediately became, how do we ensure that none of those funds are diverted? We needed answers quickly. I already had built a relationship with the Palestinian Minister of Finance. We had had dinners, we had gone for walks in downtown Ramallah, and we had established real trust. When the crisis hit, the Hamas being elected, my staff tried the normal channels to reach him. They faxed, they emailed, they called, nothing. Everyone was trying to reach this one guy. So one morning I asked the office car to drop me directly at the ministry. I'm pretty bold that way. I showed my diplomatic ID, I handed over my phone at the front desk, and I was escorted upstairs. And the waiting room outside his office was packed. I said hi to the Egyptian, Jordanian, Syrian, Dutch, and German ambassadors. I gave a little wave to the Turkish ambassador from a safe distance because he was chain smoking in the corner. I remember this quite vividly. I found the last empty. I sat down and I pulled out my copy of The Economist magazine. And because I was prepared for a very long wait. But shortly after that, the door opened and the minister looked out. He scanned this room and he saw me, the only woman in a room full of impatient male ambassadors. And he was like, Kathy, come on in. So over tea and then he ordered lunch into the office. He spoke with remarkable candor. He explained to me how blindsided the Palestinian Authority had been by Hamas's victory, and how different governments were rushing to freeze accounts, and how his ministry was scrambling to find workarounds to keep the aid flowing and the machinery of government intact. The Palestinian Authority, in effect, was as determined as the government of Canada to prevent these funds being diverted to Hamas. So it was an amazing two-way discussion. And at the end of a very long discussion and lunch and tea, I was in a position to send a comprehensive report back to my government. Why? Because I had built this important relationship before the crisis hit. I knew in advance, I knew effectively from day one that the finance minister was someone I needed to know. And when that moment came, that connection mattered. So for me, diplomacy is not strategy on one side and human connection on the other. It is strategy carried through human connection. That, in essence, is what the job of being a good diplomat is about.
And you told us that you needed to find people who you can trust and build a relationship with them. Do you think that applies in Iraq, Slovakia, everywhere?
It applies everywhere you go without exception. It is the core necessity, the most important thing about being an effective diplomat.
Good. And now I want to take you into one of the most defining parts of your career. What does a typical day look like for an ambassador in Iraq?
A day in the life, yes. Well, it's long, it's busy, and it never unfolds exactly as you might expect. I arrived in Baghdad as Canada's ambassador just a few weeks before the war began on October 7th, 2023. You'll recall there was the heinous mass assault on southern Israel and then the bloody aftermath and the bombing that continues to this day in Gaza. So we had militias in Baghdad sympathetic to the Palestinian people who were marching and protesting in and around the Green Zone, where many of the embassies are located, including our own. And there were threats against Western interests. So as a result, we had to shift our priorities and to focus more on security protocols and our readiness. We were preparing for an evacuation. As ambassador, of course, I was called into many more security briefings. And at one point, I was also asked to brief the Office of the Canadian Prime Minister for a call that we set up with Iraq's Prime Minister. So that was the context. And I would say, because you're posted abroad, the reason you're posted abroad and you're living in that hosted country and you're formally accredited to the host government is to engage with that government, to engage with local interlocutors on issues where there's alignment between Canada's interests and bilateral relations, such as national and regional security, economic issues, human rights, trade and investment opportunities. I took recommendations from my team for meetings aligned with these priorities and generally scheduled 1 to 2 meetings with good interlocutors every day. At the same time, I was the leader of the team and manager of an office. That's a core part of being an ambassador as well. So I needed to spend quality time in the office. I started each day greeting the Canadian and Iraqi staff as they arrived. This was
so you had Iraqi staff in your embassy.
Yes, and this is an important point to clarify, because at every Canadian embassy or high commission or consular agency abroad, you have a core team of Canadian diplomats.
And you have local workers too.
You have local staff. We call them locally engaged staff, or LES, and they are the backbone of every mission, because they don't rotate in and out, every 1, 2, or 3 years. They are permanent staff, and they have the corporate memory. Of course, they're fluent in the local languages and dialects, and they build up this extensive network of contacts over the years. So they're absolutely essential. So yes, I loved that part of starting my day like that. I learned a lot from the local staff, and I got the latest news from them, intel on what was happening in Baghdad. How was their commute to the office? from their house or their apartment building? What new construction projects did they see on the way? Were there any protests in the streets? And I learned details about their lives, what they volunteered to share, of course. I learned, what challenges they were facing with real estate purchases, with their kids' schools, with daycare. Sometimes we talked about celebrity gossip. These were essentially the same issues you might discuss over your early morning coffee in a Canadian office. And then I usually had one or two group or one-on-one meetings, maybe a meeting with all staff or the Committee on Mission Security or the mission management meeting in the morning. And then I would head out, as I said, on meetings with Iraqis that were trade or politically focused. And that took up already a big chunk of my day. Every night, then, there were multiple social events, and I needed to select which one to attend that would be most informative, most valuable for me and for my country. So, in general, I prioritized invitations from Iraqi hosts, but I also spent a great deal of time at the US, the Italian, the German, the Dutch, the Japanese embassies, and at events and meetings hosted by my UN colleagues or my NATO colleagues in Baghdad. And this is the way that you build strong and collaborative relationships with your colleagues. And by the end of the day, you're usually pretty spent, to be very honest. You've moved between security issues, staff management, political meetings, economic files, and then the evening diplomatic circuit, and all of it, every second of it requires you to be alert and switched on. So there isn't really such a thing as a quote unquote typical day. That's probably a main point I'd make. It's a job where you're constantly adjusting, constantly representing Canada, and constantly trying to make good judgments in a pretty complicated environment. In a place like Iraq, with all the volatility and all the competing pressures and all the traffic jams, that can be pretty exhausting, but also incredibly important and at times very rewarding.
I understand. That's very insightful because you bring us a view that we don't have in the media today, in our local media. So that's very insightful. Thank you, Katie. So you'll have a minute and I have questions for you and you can only answer yes or no and I'll ask the most questions to you.
Okay, I'm nervous, but I'm excited.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, I'll start the timer. Here we go. After everything you've seen and experienced, are you optimistic about the future?
No.
Do you think diplomacy is more instinct than training?
Instinct, so I guess that's a yes.
Do personal relationships matter more than policy in diplomacy?
Yes.
Did your perception of conflict change after Iraq?
Yes.
Were relationships harder to build in that context?
No, Iraqis are amazing.
Was Slovakia a completely different diplomatic environment?
Yes, love Slovakia and Slovaks.
Did you enjoy the European context more?
Yes, it's more glamorous, but the issues and the politics were more interesting in Iraq.
Does culture play a major role in your work?
Regrettably, no.
Is pressure constant in diplomacy?
Yes.
Do you need to adapt your personality depending on who you meet?
Yes.
Good. Well, thank you for your answers. You answered a little more than half the questions, so that's kind of good. What's one achievement from your time in Iraq that you're especially proud of?
Well, in my perception, and it might not be shared, the key role of an ambassador is to serve as Canada's eyes, ears abroad. So I'll tie my greatest achievement as ambassador to Iraq to that. As you know, we have the news everywhere. The media is everywhere, 24/7, multiple news channels, social media, broadcasts, podcasts, everywhere. But it's not always analytical. It's not always objective. It's very superficial. in my humble opinion. And it's certainly filtered through a lens of Canadian interests, priorities, and values. And this is where diplomacy continues to matter. My job was to go deep into that society, to understand what was happening on the ground, what it meant for Canada, and to get that insight back to headquarters in a useful form. So I told you earlier that I aimed for 1 or 2 substantive meetings every day with trusted senior Iraqis or diplomats or security contacts or business figures. But the point was never simply to accumulate information. If I just kept what I learned in my head, I was failing. My responsibility was to turn these conversations into reporting back to headquarters, to formulate it as a recommendation to headquarters, to plan for high-level visits and practical advice that would help Ottawa and Canadian business and the Government of Canada make better decisions. And that mattered because Canada has a wide range of interests in Iraq. We were active in the NATO mission in Iraq, in the global coalition against Daesh, the Islamic State, fighting terrorism in that region of the world. We have Canadian armed forces deployed in the country. We also have important commercial interests. We want to sell more stuff to Iraq, and we're very active in the pharmaceuticals sector, exports of wheat and pulses, selling machinery, electronic equipment, and growing potential in sectors like energy, healthcare, and higher education. So if I had to name my greatest achievement, I've taken a roundabout way to get to the answer, but I would say my greatest achievement was consistently providing Canada with timely, informed, reliable, and grounded analysis, the kind of stuff that the media doesn't have the resources to do. And I was providing this analysis at a time when the war that was ongoing, the wars that are ongoing, providing that analysis at a time when that kind of judgment really mattered.
And you have a great understanding of Middle East since you were former ambassador in Iraq. The ongoing war in the Middle East between USA and Iran and the increasing number of countries engaged in the conflict. What's on your mind about this?
Yeah, well, thanks for acknowledging my knowledge of my knowledge of the Middle East. I've traveled extensively in the region. I was an election observer in Lebanon. I had a posting, as I said, based in Ramallah and working in the West Bank and Gaza. And I studied the Arabic language for 2 years, and then, of course, Iraq. And so getting back to your question, what's on my mind? Well, the ongoing war is awful. It destroys lives, homes, and any sense of normalcy. And I do not think we should ever become casual about that. What troubles me right now, media focus is so often on the wrong things. We hear endlessly, no matter the media channel, about tanker traffic, the Strait of Hormuz, crude prices, and what all this means at the gas pump. Those issues matter, of course. I'm feeling them, you're feeling them, but they should not eclipse the human story. What should be leading the news right now is the rights of civilians, the destruction of homes and infrastructure, hundreds of thousands of families displaced, and the very real human cost across the region. Look, international humanitarian law is not optional. Parties to a conflict are required to distinguish between military objectives and civilians, and to take all feasible precautions to avoid or minimize civilian harm. And franchement, I don't see this happening. What's also on my mind is the way one war can distract from another. What's happening in Ukraine and Gaza, these senseless conflicts have not disappeared simply because attention has shifted to the Strait of Hormuz. And while the Middle East is in flames, human rights abuses are becoming more flagrant. In the West Bank, for example, killings, displacement, and property destruction, and the illegal occupation of land is taking place on an unprecedented scale. So what's on my mind is very simple. Civilians are paying the price, while much of the commentary obsesses over markets and geopolitics. That, in a nutshell, is the wrong hierarchy of concern, if I can put it that way.
I understand. So you're saying that the media should really speak about the human side of the conflict more than the money side.
Well, I don't know about you, but when I was a university student, I certainly remember many more social stories. There were articles about international assistance and where it was effective and why it wasn't ineffective. And there were in-depth stories, profiles in newspapers like the Globe and Mail and Le Devoir. And, one of the things that made that possible was that our national broadcast agencies, they deployed people to those areas, so they lived there and they had a network of contacts. But with budget cutbacks and budget pressures, now we send in journalists to report on this current conflict, US and Israel versus Iran and the whole region, more and more countries involved. We send someone in to report on it for 2 days or a week, and then we send someone new, and you just can't get to the same depth of analysis that we used to. You can't get to the same insights that I think people want to learn about and to really understand what is going on there.
I understand. So to bring it back to a more personal level, would you choose the same path? If you had to advise a young person who wants to become a diplomat, what would you tell them?
Oh, this is a weighted question. Would I choose the same path? I'm going to say, honestly, no, not under the current conditions. I believe deeply in diplomacy, but Canadian diplomacy today is not structured to deliver results in line with our values and interests. And I'll explain why. Our footprint abroad is simply not geared to where Canada needs to be engaged. We have acknowledged this repeatedly in reports and assessments and recommendations. We've promised to adapt, and yet nothing changes. Inertia has a firm foothold in our Foreign Affairs Department, Global Affairs Canada. Despite a world that has shifted dramatically toward the Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, Africa, and other emerging regions, our resources remain heavily concentrated in the traditional postings and the multilateral missions, these glamorous postings, Vienna, Geneva, New York, London, Paris, Washington, and the vast majority of our staff in foreign affairs are at headquarters in Ottawa. That makes no sense at all. And as I said, multiple reports have said this makes no sense at all.
Yeah, because people are like making decisions in Ottawa while you're in position in the country. And I think that it's weird because people in Ottawa take decisions while you're aware of what's happening.
It's so true. Sometimes overriding my decisions, which, I'm being very honest with you, sometimes overriding my decisions, even though I'm there in that country and I speak the language and I'm getting my information directly from the government of Iraq and from informed sources. And that's just wrong in so many ways. So when you concentrate all your resources in Vienna and Washington and at headquarters, then you have so many other strategically important countries, the middle countries where Canada says we need to engage more, where Canada has only a handful of diplomats. You would be shocked, but we have missions. When I was in Slovakia, I was the only Canadian diplomat. Now, I had a really, really strong and brilliant team of Slovaks who worked in the office, but there are so many offices still today where you have 1, 2, 3, or 4 Canadian diplomats in big countries. And over 3 decades, I watched our presence shrink, not grow, but shrink incrementally with each budget cycle, even as global complexity increased. We speak of partnerships. The speech by our Prime Minister, the amazing speech our Prime Minister Carney delivered at the Davos Security Forum, talked about the importance of partnerships with middle powers and working with these middle powers to advance Canadian interests globally, but we have not deployed the people needed to achieve this. So this disconnect between what we say we want to do and what we can do is also reinforced by how we recruit and manage talent in the Foreign Service, which is, of course, part of the larger Canadian public service. We need to bring in people who are prepared to serve where Canada's interests are most engaged and who have real knowledge of those regions, including language and cultural fluency. Too often, however, the system still gravitates to the traditional, more comfortable postings, and I named some. Then talent management should elevate those people, those diplomats, those public servants who demonstrate results, who show sound judgment, strong analysis, and the ability to advance Canadian interests while leading effectively. But the system that's in place is neither objective nor credible, and it's not working. The entire public service HR, human resources structure is stuck. I can't find a better word. It's stuck. It's a system afraid of its own decisions, whether you're talking about hiring, promotions, or performance management. Very little of substance has changed in decades. It's rigid and it's formulaic. It claims to be merit-based, but when you track the growing reliance on non-advertised appointments, it's far from that ideal. It is no longer a system, if it ever was, that places the right people with the right skills and the right roles at the right time. It's also painfully slow, and it's burdened by process, appeals, labor relations disputes, rigid classifications and employment groups that are guarded firmly by the unions, all of which fosters a culture of risk aversion. And in that environment, managers who try to uphold standards, shift priorities to match the current day government priorities, protect public resources, use them in the most effective way, or address poor performance, well, those managers who try to do these things can quickly find themselves accused of harassment or micromanagement and see their careers derailed by untested allegations. What's most disheartening is that no one in a position of leadership seems willing or able to change this. So what would I say, going back to your question, what would I advise a young person who wants to be a diplomat? First, be clear about why you want it. If what attracts you is glamour, titles, or the illusion of elegant receptions, you will be disappointed. But if you are curious about the world, willing to live uncomfortably at times, committed to public service, and interested in helping your country navigate complexity, it can still be an extraordinary life. Just go into it with your eyes open and be prepared not only to represent Canada, but to help reinvent, to transform how Canada does diplomacy.
And being former ambassador, do you think that Canada is behind other countries in terms of diplomacy?
Whoa, that's a complicated question. I think all countries struggle with some of the same challenges. We're all facing budget cuts. We're all facing budgetary pressures. Keeping a diplomatic service deployed abroad, sustaining their training, encouraging training that equips them with the language skills for the country they're going to, all that is very expensive. I would say some countries are making a more determined investment in transforming their foreign service than we are. And so Canada needs to catch up.
And looking ahead, what's your second career plan that we spoke about earlier?
Oh, thank you for asking. I'm really excited about my second career, actually, because I'm going to focus on some fundamentals like reporting and writing, which I've never stopped doing, except now I'll be able to do those things with more freedom and innovation. So I'm working on a book. You're the first to know. It has the working title is quote unquote Bag Lady, which I hope people find fun. It's supposed literal and metaphorical. So it reflects the reality of moving constantly from post to post, often living out of suitcases or duffel bags, but also at times carrying the institutional baggage of others, the metaphorical baggage of others, the disappointment of people who feel sidelined, the grievances of those with too little to do, or the exhaustion of those who are doing 3 jobs at the same time, the low-grade despair of employees who have spent entire careers at the same level while watching others move ahead. None of this does much for morale, as you can imagine. Missions abroad are not inhabited by abstract public servants. They're inhabited by human beings who carry frustrations, stalled ambitions, perceived injustices, and the accumulated wear and tear of a system that too often manages people poorly. So my book, Bag Lady, it's a collection of wry, candid, funny stories from my postings in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. And between the lines, there's a more serious advocacy, let's put it that way, that Canada needs a fundamental rethink of how it does diplomacy, its footprint abroad, how it recruits, trains, and promotes people, and how it positions itself in a world increasingly shaped by superpowers, illiberal actors, and a great deal of misinformation and disinformation. And once the book is out, and naturally a bestseller, I'd like to move into investigative journalism, which, as I said, is more of what I consider my greatest achievement abroad, doing these in-depth reports, informing our government of the news, many layers beneath the news they're reading. So investigative journalism, I've seen firsthand how much of what passes for news is superficial or just simply incomplete. I think there's real value in deeper, more independent, more in-depth reporting that helps people understand what's actually happening rather than just reactions to events. So in many ways, my second career will not be a departure, but rather a continuation. I'll be using a different platform and a slightly sharper pen.
And do you have a release date for the book?
Let's say aiming for early 2027.
All right. Well, we'll tell our audience about it when it comes out, and maybe we'll see you again on the podcast. So, thank you. Merci beaucoup, Katie, d'avoir accepté notre invitation sur le forum politique.
Well, thank you for giving me some excellent questions, which get to the core of the issues. And it was a real pleasure to participate in this forum politique. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.